Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in 2014, President Obama said he wanted to go to Cuba if, and I quote, "I with confidence can say that we're seeing some progress in liberty and freedom. If we're going backwards," President Obama said, "then there's not much reason for me to be there. I'm not interested in just validating the status quo," end quote. Well, look at this poster, Mr. Speaker. These are human rights dissidents who were rounded up and beaten. If Obama's Cuba policy is not going backwards, I don't know what is, because the oppressive Cuban apparatus of repression only seems to be emboldened. Mr. Speaker, yesterday in Havana, Raul Castro was asked by a reporter if he would release political prisoners in Cuba. Castro looked uncomfortable. Why? Because in Cuba there's no free press. Reporters are not allowed to ask real questions to leaders. Castro said, well, if there are no political prisoners in Cuba at all, and if there were, he would free them by nightfall. That's a good one. Well, there are 11 million people imprisoned by Castro's communist regime, the entire island. But here's a list, Mr. Speaker, of over 50 political prisoners that I'd like to put in the record. And this is a list comprised by the Cuban Democratic Directorate. Some of these individuals have been in jail for over 20 years. Others are constantly detained, released, and rearrested. During his time in Cuba, President Obama failed to announce any substantive changes on policies such as the fugitive policy. Are there any news on returning New Jersey cop killer Joanne Chesimard, or any of the other fugitives of U.S. justice, such as Charles Hill, William Guillermo Morales, or Victor Manuel Herrera? No news. On confiscated property, there was no positive announcement about the Castro regime paying back Americans who had their properties confiscated. There was no announcement by Castro about improving human rights in the island. Castro denied that human rights violations occur in Cuba. Again, look at this poster. As predicted, Castro also demanded the return of the naval station at Guantanamo Bay. This Congress has been very clear that it strongly opposes relinquishing Gitmo or transferring detainees to the United States. Now, President Obama incorrectly keeps calling the communist strongman Castro President Castro. Wrong. He is not president of Cuba. There have never been elections. There are no political parties except the Communist Party in Cuba. There are no free and fair elections. He is not president. Stop calling a dictator president. The president, our president, Obama, proclaimed that this trip to Cuba would be fun. That's his word. It fun to all of the Cubans who have been beaten, leading up to the president's visit. It hasn't been fun to all the Cubans who have been prevented from leaving their homes until the president departs Cuba because they are human rights activists. Now let me show you this other poster, Mr. Speaker. This is a poster of President Reagan with Gorbachev in 1987. And what happened there? President Reagan said, Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. In Havana 2016, President Obama says, thank you, President Castro, for your spirit of openness. Spirit of openness? And again, president what? He's not a president. What openness when press is prohibited in Cuba? What openness when the Cuban people are jailed for dissenting views? What openness when the economy is controlled by one entity, the communist regime? America, under the Obama administration, has forsaken those who suffer under Castro's oppression. That's a sad fact. And this will be President Obama's legacy, Mr. Speaker. The president who abdicated America's role as a defender of international human rights, all for a narcissistic play at building a legacy as the president who restored Americans' relations with dictators and tyrants who will do anything to undermine our country and harm our interests and our citizens. And that is all there is about Cuba. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.